Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our continued reading of Island of the Blue Dolphins by Scott O'Dell. It is so good to see you. We will be continuing with chapter 18 and really quick recap of what we read before. Remember, she made Rontu, which was the wild dog, her pet, and he stayed and lived with her. And some days he kind of seemed to have this wild instinct, and so he would sometimes go off. And in this last chapter, we read that actually he was with the group of wild dogs and they attacked him, and she didn't intervene. She let him hold his own, let him fight it out, and he came back to be with her. So she was very, very excited because he still wanted to be with her, and he never went to see the wild dogs again. So now she really has a faithful partner, a faithful pet, and she was very, very excited about that at the very end of our last chapter, which was chapter 18. Don't forget, if you want to print out any of the Thinking Journal pages, they are on connectedplanetlearning.com. You can join up and print them out. If you are not going to use the Thinking Journal, go ahead and jot down things on your parking lot. So remember, if you want to use paper or a whiteboard as a place to kind of keep your ideas while you're reading or draw pictures while you're listening, that is totally okay and greatly encouraged. Okay, also write down any questions that you might have because that will allow you to kind of do some research afterwards. Okay, let's continue with chapter 18. Flowers were plentiful that spring because of the winter's heavy rains. The dunes were covered with mats of sand flowers, which are red and have tiny eyes that are sometimes pink and sometimes white. Yuccas grow tall among the rocks of the ravine. Their heads were clustered with curly globes, no larger than pebbles and the color of the sun when it rises. Lupins grew where the springs ran. From the sunny cliffs in crevices where no one would think anything could grow, sprang the little red and yellow fountains of the comel bush. Birds were plentiful too. There were many hummers which can stand still in the air and look like bits of polished stone and have long tongues to sip honey with. There were blue jays, which are very quarrelsome birds, and black and white peckers that pecked holes in the yucca stalks and the poles of my roof, even in the whalebones of the fence. Red-winged blackbirds also came flying out of the south, and flocks of crows, and a bird with a yellow body and a scarlet head, which I had never seen before. A pair of these birds made a nest in a stunted tree near my house. It was made from strings of the yucca bush and had a small opening at the top and hung down like a pouch. The mother laid 2 speckled eggs, which she and her mate took turns sitting on. After the eggs hatched, I put shreds of abalone under the tree, and these she fed to her young. The young birds were not like their father or mother, being gray and very ugly. But anyway, I took them from the nest and put them in a small cage that I made of some reeds. So later in the spring, when all the birds except the crows left the island and flew off to the north, I had these 2 for friends. They soon grew beautiful feathers like those of their parents and began to make the same sound, which was reep, reep. But it was soft and clear and much sweeter than the cries of the gulls or the crows or the talk of the pelicans, which sounds like the quarreling of toothless old men. Before summer came, the cage was too small for my 2 birds, but instead of building a larger one, I cut the tips of their wings, 1 wing of each, so they could not fly away, and let them loose in my house. By the time their wings had grown out, they had learned to take food from my hand. They would jump down from the roof and perch on my arm and beg, making their reep, reep sound. When their wings began to feather out, I cut them again. This time I let them loose in the yard, where they hopped around hunting food, perching on Rontu, who by now had gotten used to them. The next time they feathered out, I did not trim their wings, but they never flew farther away than the ravine and would always come back at night to sleep, and no matter how much they had eaten, to ask for food. So I really want to quickly explain what she did. She did not cut the wings of the birds. She just cut the flight feathers. And basically that makes them unbalanced. So if they don't have feathers all the way to their tips, like our fingers, they can't fly. And so when they can't fly, they won't leave because it unbalances them and they can't fly. Okay, so she basically cut the feathers, not the wings. It sounds like she cuts the wings, but she just cuts the outer feathers, which is like trimming your fingernails. It doesn't hurt the birds, especially if you know what you're doing. And so what she did was she initially trimmed them so they couldn't fly until they got used to her, and then she let them grow out completely. So you can see the bird's feathers are just kind of like our fingernails. They keep growing out and growing out. And so this was her way of taming those two wild birds. So I just wanted to quickly explain that so you guys could see that she wasn't cutting their wings. She was just cutting the feathers, their flight feathers. And so now they would stay close. They wouldn't go far away. One, because he was larger, I called a Tanner. I named him after a young man I liked who had been killed by the Aleuts. The other was called Lorai, which is the name I wished I had been called instead of Karana. During the time that I was taming the birds, I made another skirt. This one I made of yucca fibers, softened in water and braided in twine. I made it just like the others, with folds running lengthwise. It was open on both sides and hung to my knees. The belt I made of sealskin, which could be tied in a knot. I also made a pair of sandals from sealskin for walking over the dunes when the sun was hot, or just to be dressed up when I wore my new skirt of yucca twine. Often I put on the skirt and sandals and walk along the cliff with Rontu. Sometimes I made a wreath of flowers and fastened it to my hair. After the Aleuts had killed our men at Coral Cove, all the women of our tribe had singed their hair short, a sign of mourning. I had singed mine too, with a faggot, but now it had grown long again and come to my waist. So they kind of burned their hair off, which was a way of cutting their hair to show that they were sad about all the people that died. Then I made braids and fastened them with long whalebone pins. I also made a wreath for Rontu's neck, which he did not like. Together we would walk along the cliff, looking at the sea, and though the white man's ship did not return that spring, it was a happy time. The air smelled of flowers and birds sang everywhere. So you can see she's settling into her new home. She is happy with her pets. She's making new clothes for herself, and she even just dresses up to go out. Chapter 19. See what happens next. Another summer had come, and still I had not speared the giant devilfish that lived near the cave. Every day during the spring, Rontu and I went to look for him. I would put the canoe in the water and paddle slowly through the cave, from one opening to the other, often several times. I saw many devilfish, for there where the black water is streaked with light, but not the giant one. At last I gave up looking for him and began to gather abalones for winter. The red shells hold the sweetest meat and are best for drying, though the green ones and the black ones are also good. Because the red ones are the sweetest, starfish prey on them. This star-shaped creature places itself over the shell of an abalone, with its 5 arms spread out against the rock to which the abalone is fastened. It holds the shell with its suckers and begins to lift itself. The starfish pulls against the abalone shell, sometimes for days, holding on with its suckers and pushing up with its legs until little by little the heavy shell comes loose from the body. One morning we left the cave and paddled out to the reef, which was joined to it. For many days I had been gathering a few shellfish in the rocks at Coral Cove, but I had been watching the reef and waiting for the right time to harvest. This is when there are few starfish feeding, for they are hard to pry loose from an abalone, as an abalone is to pry from a rock. The tide was low and the reef rose far out of the water. Along its sides were great numbers of red abalones and very few starfish, so before the sun was high, I filled the bottom of the canoe. The day was windless, and since I had all I could carry, I tied the canoe, and with Rontu following me, we climbed back to the reef to look for fish to spear for supper. Blue dolphins were leaping beyond the kelp beds, and the kelp otter were playing at the games they never tired of, and around me were the gulls fishing for scallops, which were numerous that summer. They grew on the floating kelp leaves, and there were so many of them that much of the kelp near the reef had been dragged to the bottom. Still, there were scallops that the gulls could reach, and taking them in their beaks, they would fly far above the reef and let them drop. The gulls would then swoop down to the rocks and pick the meat from the broken shells. Scallops fell on the reef like rain, which amused me, but not Rontu, who did not understand what the gulls were doing. Dodging this way and that, I went to the end of the reef where the biggest fish live. With a sinew line and a hook made of abalone shell, I caught two, and had large heads and long teeth, but are good to eat. I gave one to Rontu, and on the way back into the canoe gathered purple sea urchins to use for dyeing. Rontu, who was trotting along in front of me, suddenly dropped his fish and stood looking down over the edge of the reef. There, swimming in the clear water, was a devilfish. It was the same one I had been hunting for. It was the giant. Seldom did you see any devilfish here, for they like deep places, and the water along this part of the reef is shallow. Perhaps this one lived in the cave and came out here only when he could not find food. Rontu made no sound. I fixed the head of the spear and the long string that held it to my wrist. Then I crawled back to the edge of the reef. The giant had not moved. He was floating just below the surface of the water, and I could plainly see his eyes. They were the size of small stones and stood out from his head. With black rims and gold centers, and in the centers a black spot like the eyes of the spirit I had once seen on a night that rain fell and lightning forked in the sky. Where my hands rested was a deep crevice, and in it a fish was hiding. The giant was half the length of my spear from the reef, but while I watched, one of his long arms ran out like a snake and felt its way into the crevice. It went past the fish and along the side of the rock, and then the end of it curled back. As the arm gently wound itself around the fish from behind, I rose to one knee and drove the spear. I aimed at the giant's head, but though it was larger than my two fishes and a good target, I missed. The spear struck down through the water and slanted off. Instantly, the black clouds surrounded the devilfish. The only thing I could see of him was one long arm still grasping his prey. I jumped to my feet and pulled on the spear, thinking that I might have a chance to throw it again. As I did so, the shaft bobbed back to the surface, and I saw that the barbed point had come loose. At the same moment, the string tightened. My grip on it broke, and aware that I had struck the devilfish, I quickly dropped the coils I held, for when the string runs out fast, it burns your hands or becomes entangled. The devilfish does not swim with fins or flippers like other things in the sea. He takes water in through a hole in the front of his body and pushes the water out behind through two slits. When he was swimming slowly, you can see the two streams trailing out, but only then. When he moves fast, you can see nothing except a streak in the water. The coils I had dropped on the rock hopped and sang as they ran. Then there were no more of them. The string tightened on my wrist, and to lessen the shock, I leaped across the crevice in the direction the giant had taken. With the string in both hands, but still fastened to my wrist, I braced my feet on the slippery rock and leaned backwards. The string snapped tight with the weight of the devilfish. It began to stretch, and I feared it might break. I walked forward, yet I made him pull me every step. He was moving toward the cave along the edge of the reef. The cave was a good distance away. If he got there, I would surely lose him. The canoe was tied just in front of me. Once I was in it, I could let him pull me until he grew tired. There was no way to untie the canoe and still hold on to the string. Rontu all this time was running up and down the reef, barking and leaping at me, which made my task harder. Step by step, I walked forward until the devilfish was in the deep water close to the cave. He was so close that I had to stop, even if the sinew broke and I lost him. Therefore, I braced myself and did not move. The sinew stretched, throwing off drops of water. I could hear it stretch, and I was sure it would break. I did not feel it cutting into my hands, though they bled. The pull suddenly lessened, and I was sure that he was gone. But the next instant I saw the string cutting the wire in a wide circle. He was swimming off from the cave and the reef towards some rocks that were about twice the length of the string away. He would be safe there too, for among them were many places to hide. I pulled in half the string while he was moving toward the rocks, but soon had to let it out. It grew tight again and began to stretch. The water here was only a little over my waist. I let myself down over the reef. There was a sandbar not far from the rocks, and stepping carefully on the bottom, which was full of holes, I slowly made my way toward it. Rontu swam by my side. I reached the sandbar before the devilfish could hide himself in the rocks. The string held, and he turned about and once more swam toward the cave. Twice again he did this. Each time I took in some of the string. The third time, as he came up to the shallow water, I walked backward across the sandbar so he would not see me, and pulled on the string with all my strength. The giant slid up on the sand. He lay with his arms spread out, partly in the water, and I thought he was dead. Then I saw his eyes moving. Before I could shout a warning, Rontu had rushed forward and seized him, but the devilfish was too heavy to lift or shake. As Rontu's jaws sought another hold, 3 of the many arms wound themselves around his neck. Devilfish are only dangerous in the water, where they can fasten themselves to you with their long arms. These arms have rows of suckers underneath them, and they can drag you under where you drown. But even on land, the devilfish can injure you, for he is strong and does not die quickly. The giant was flailing his arms, struggling to get back in the water. Little by little, he was dragging Rontu with him. I could no longer use the string because it was wound around Rontu's leg. The whalebone knife I used for prying abalones from the rocks was tied to a thong at my waist. The blade was thick at the point, but had a sharp edge. I dropped the coils of the string and unfastened the knife as I ran. I ran past the devilfish and got between him and the deep water. So many of his arms were flailing that it was useless to cut any of them. One struck me on the leg and burned like a whip. Another, which Rontu had chewed off, lay wiggling in the edge of the water as if it were looking for something to fasten to. The head rose out of the twisting arm like a giant stalk. The gold eyes with their black rims were fixed on me. Above the sounds of the waves and water splashing and Rontu's barking, I could hear the snapping of his beak, which was sharper than a knife. The knife I held in my hand. I drove the knife down into his body, and as I did this, was suddenly covered, or so it seemed, with countless numbers of leeches sucking at my skin. Fortunately, one hand was free, the hand that held the knife, and again I struck down through the tough hide. The suckers, which were fastened to me pained greatly, lessened their hold. Slowly the arm stopped moving and grew limp. I tried to drag the devilfish out of the water, but my strength was gone. I did not even go back to the reef for my canoe. Though I did take the shaft and the head of the spear, which had cost me much labor, and the sinew line. It was night before Rontu and I got back to the house. Rontu had a gash on his nose from the giant's beak, and I had many cuts and bruises. I saw 2 more giant devilfish along the reef that summer, but I did not try to spear them. So what do you think the devilfish is? That is the end of chapter 19. Based on what we know about it, it spurts out ink. It has long arms. She doesn't say how many, but I think probably 8. And they have suctions on them, suction cups. So what animal do you think she was trying to catch? I think you're right. I think it's an octopus. Yeah. So she tried to catch a giant octopus and decided that was probably not a really good idea. She almost got pulled into the water. Rontu almost got sucked into the water with this big giant octopus. And even though she tried and she did a pretty good job of killing that one, she never tried to do it again because she decided it was way too much work. Do you remember why she originally wanted to kill the octopus? Yeah, she wanted to try and eat it because she said that the meat was really yummy. So she kept an eye on it and finally did have a chance to try and kill it, which she did, but decided it was not worth all the trouble. So that is the end of chapter 19. Next time we will read chapter 20. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you next time.